Okay, I am thankful that I've managed to get through to my first guest. A guest that we used to have on much more often, but what with all the changes, we haven't spoken to him for a while. So delighted to welcome back to the show, Jonathan Davis. Good evening, Jonathan.
Thank you, Kenny. Delighted to be back on.
Yeah, welcome. Nice to speak to you. In fact, before we go any further, I'm going to talk to you about London a little bit just for a second, because I spoke to you a couple of weeks ago when we were trying to get you on, and you were telling me you were going out to the theatre to see Singing in the Rain in London, and I tell you what, you made me homesick.
Well, I didn't intend to do that, but I can tell you, if any of your listeners are popping back to Blighty, I can heartily recommend Singing in the Rain. I'm a bit of a musicals, a film musicals aficionado, and I actually wasn't expecting very much from the stage musical, but you know what? It was just beautiful. And amazingly, there was real rain, but I won't spoil anyone's surprise as to how that actually happened.
Oh, wow, okay. Well, I am, like yourself, I am a bit of a musical fan, both for the theatre and film, and I love Singing in the Rain. And as I said to you on email, Make 'em Laugh, Make 'em Laugh, Make 'em Laugh is one of my all-time comedy, numbers. I just think that's fantastic. Just one quick question then. Did they have any big stars in it, or was it all people?
No, they were all unknowns, but I do beg your pardon, Michael Brandon, who some of you would remember
Cagney
from the
and Lacey.
70s.
Not Cagney and Lacey.
He was in something with, in the 1970s, he was in some sort of science fiction detective type thing with Joanna Lumley, you may possibly recall. And he played the big producer, the head of the studio.
Ah, okay, right. But I think he was also one half of a male-female cop duo, when the blonde-haired woman.
Really? Oh, how interesting.
I think so, yeah. Interesting.
Okay.
Well, as I say, when I heard you were doing that, because if anything that's going on in London, it's like the Olympics when the ceremony was on last week, and I thought, God, if I was there, I would have been there, because, I love London. I miss London. I don't miss England per se, to be perfectly honest, but it's just London and all that goes on in London I miss a little bit, but there you go. Well, I'm glad you had a good time. That's great news.
Yes, thank you.
Now, I was telling the listener earlier, I don't mean to offend you, but I was telling the listener earlier that the last time you came on, I felt like going home and jumping off the bridge, to be honest with you. You depressed me. But I have to say, a lot of your predictions were pretty spot on. So should I invest in a microwave, or am I okay with my oven at home in a moment? How's things looking?
It's interesting you use a cooking metaphor. I'll use one myself.
Okay.
Basically, we're toast. Economically and financially, people. I mean, your listeners, and you're in Spain. 25% unemployment, 50% if you're under the age of 25. I mean, that is obviously depression levels. The EU is in depression. The UK is in depression, although we don't yet experience it as bad as Greece, Spain and Portugal, but believe me, it's coming. China is in recession, probably heading into depression. Japan's been in depression for 20-odd years, and the US is also in recession, leading to depression. The global economy is in recession, much of it in depression. In other words, it's extremely painful. And until the policymakers change the policies, which actually will not happen because it's politically untenable, I'm afraid they're going to keep us in depression. So it's every man and woman for themselves, I'm afraid.
When you
they're not going to bail us out.
When you say it's untenable, what do you mean by that?
Well, we know of examples around the world in even relatively recent history, the last few decades, where politicians have taken the hard decisions, such as they have balanced their budgets as opposed to kept borrowing ad infinitum, such as they've stopped bailing out the enterprises which got them into difficulties in the first place. Our example currently would be the bankers. And within a couple of years of major difficulty, no doubt, I'm not, these things wouldn't create an instant nirvana, but after a couple of years of difficulty, they then experience significant growth. I'm talking about very recently, I'm talking about Estonia and Iceland. Over the last 10 or 20 years, we've got examples of Russia, Chile. These are not insignificant countries where by taking the hard decisions, there's a couple of hard years and then 10 or 20 years of growth. But the existing politicians in America, in the UK, in most of Europe, in Japan and China, they are not taking any hard decisions whatsoever. Therefore, they continue to keep us in 20 or 30 years of recession, which ultimately means, of course, depression. And it can only get worse in the likes of the UK, in Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy. These are basket cases. They are never going to recover until the politicians take the hard decisions. But it's not going to happen.
You mentioned Iceland. I think Iceland's a very good example. I mean, they recovered very quickly by taking, as you say, the harsh medicine and then seemed to recover very fast. That's a very good example.
And you have to understand, the mainstream media went with shall we say, the traditional economists and the bankers at the time with Iceland, because Iceland said, we're going to tell the bankers where to go. We're going to default on all those loans which were recklessly loaned. And everyone in the mainstream said, well, Iceland is going to be an economic pariah for, metaphorically, 1,000 years. It's going to be in an ice age. As you say, 3 years later, Iceland is one of the fastest growing economies on the planet. And if only the Spanish politicians would have let the bankers go bust, if only the Greeks would have done the same, and the Brits, and the French, and the Americans, and the Japanese, we would now be in a state where we had a fraction of the debts that we have, but instead those debts weigh us down forever and a day. Unlike the Icelandics, who are living at large again. They're having a great improvement in the standard of living. We, however, are having year after year contraction and reductions in our standards of living.
I don't quite understand this business with Iceland, for example. I mean, the evidence is there to be seen, and we're still sort of clinging to the same old solutions, which, as you say, aren't working. This is not like something that that they can say, well, maybe it won't work. It is working. So why aren't the governments looking at this now and saying, okay, we made a mistake. This is obviously the way to go. Let's get on this.
Because actually it's politically untenable. Because although with the likes of Iceland and Estonia also, although they had a couple of years of hard recession and now they're growing, the reality is that, for example, in the US and in the UK and in Germany and France, we are in very mild recession, although take, for example, the United Kingdom, which of course your listeners will know, we haven't on a net basis had any economic growth now since 2006. But because it's drip, 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 the politicians, whichever side, whether it's the left or the right, ultimately they're exactly the same. They just pretend they're different. Because it's drip, 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 it's Chinese torture of 1,000 cuts. So it appears as if the ECG machine, it's beeping up a little, then it beeps down, it beeps up a little, then it beeps down, and they can pretend that they're trying to get some growth. Whereas if they took the hard decisions, no doubt there'd be a couple of years of immediate economic contraction, and they would be blamed for it. Even though the politicians for the last 3, 4, 5 decades, every one of them in charge is to blame for it, because it's taken that long to get us to the stage now where we are in 2 or 3 decades of recession, in other words, depression. We could get out of it within a couple, maybe 3 years, but they won't do it because they don't want to be blamed for taking the decisions which will give us the solution. They want to pretend they can do something about it. Well, do you know what? They can't do anything about it. Take the UK again as an example. We're drowning under a sea of debt. But you know what? It's actually no different to any of the countries that you and your listeners would think of. That's been the problem. We've had an increase, an explosion in debt for decades. Now we're in an era of what's called deleveraging, falling debt, but you cannot do anything other than go through hardship in an era of deleveraging.
Ed Balls made a statement in the last 48 hours or so saying that the government is relying on the Olympics to kickstart the economy. Do you think that they think that couldn't be the case? Do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah. I must say, and I hope this isn't beyond the pale, Ed Balls is a particularly appropriate name. The reality is, of course, it was under Labour that Britain got the Olympics. And the inference is that the Olympics is creating some kind of economic growth, the inference in that statement. Well, isn't it funny? Actually, last week, the Office of National Statistics in the UK announced we had a drop in the size of the economy of 0.7%. So that's the third quarter in a row that this economy has actually fallen. So to suggest that one side of the political spectrum is benefiting from the Olympics, well, maybe in show and in razzle-dazzle, but not in the actual hard numbers of the economics.
Yeah, but to be fair, Jonathan, anything that may come from the Olympics, we're not going to see yet. That's certainly what minimum next quarter, if not 2 quarters away, isn't it?
Well, indeed, and that was exactly what I was going to say. Someone said to me, is the Olympics going to bring benefit to our economy, or indeed, is it costing us too much? Well, you know, the size of the economy is £1,200 billion a year. The Olympics is costing us $10 billion. It is practically a drop in the ocean. And is it going to bring us any net benefit? Not in the slightest. It's immaterial. It's not relevant. It's just another elitist extravaganza where, as you've noticed, there are whole swathes of seats not being sat on. Why? Because the corporate sponsors are not getting their guests to sit down and so on. They're drinking champagne, something. Now, I know that I sound at that point like some raving communist Marxist or something, but the reality is, if this is meant to be an event for the people, why are we seeing hundreds and maybe thousands of seats available in some of the top sports, including at Wimbledon, for goodness sake? It's just another... and you can still buy some seats, so I'm told, at £500. You know, not exactly a ticket for the people, is it?
Well, no, but to be fair, they know that is a problem now, and Jeremy Hunt has come out today and said that they're looking at the idea that if a seat's not been sat in for the first half an hour of an event, they're going to let it go. And I think
Kenny, they've only had 7 years to plan this.
Well, that's true. Yeah, that was mentioned. That was mentioned today in an interview I heard, and they said this is how many. Somebody said, how many events has Seb Coe been to over the years? He really ought to be able to know the pitfalls of things like that. Exactly. There should have been penalties put in place, or some system whereby if they weren't taken up by a certain time, they could have been sold off cheaply or whatever. We should have queues of people outside waiting to pick up these standby tickets, because there's plenty of people want to get in.
It should be like Wimbledon. After a certain time in the day, returns can be sold to people in the queue, and indeed after I think 5 o'clock you can even get into centre court for £10 if the seat's available.
Yeah. Well, okay, let's move on from that. Let's hope, I know you're going to shoot me down in flames, but let's hope they're sitting in a room right now making that decision, and by tomorrow it's job done, and that will happen. But, I'm going to... there's the optimist in me. Listen, let's move on. The whole austerity approach, if I remember rightly, you're against that approach to recovery anyway, and you've just reiterated that really by saying we should just take the harsh medicine and get on with it. So do you disagree with the whole idea of cutbacks and steady, slowly? You just don't think that's ever going to work?
Yeah, it's never going to work. They tried it in Japan since 1989 when Japan peaked. It hasn't worked for 23 years. If that's not sufficient proof in the pudding, from the second largest economy in the world, it's now not the second largest, of course, then I don't know what more proof they require. No, all they're doing by printing the money, that the UK has printed 375 billion, the European Central Bank has printed 1,000 billion, and the Euros, and the Federal Reserve has also printed a couple of $1,000 billion. All they're doing is kicking the can down the line, whilst most of the people, the real people in society, are being affected detrimentally. In America, this will blow some of your listeners' minds. In America, a population of 308 million people, 47 million are on food stamps. Believe me, the money printing doesn't work. All it does is bail out the millionaire and billionaire bankers. What it doesn't do is get money into the economy. It doesn't help the real people.